Good morning, everyone. My name is Keyshawn Bonamy, and thank you so much for coming for what is the second day of the ACIC Symposium 2023. The topic of today's panel, of course, is decent work and the cost of exploitation, in which, with the help of our three panelists here, Carol Domenico, Gabriel Allahdua, and Nouhad Mourad, we will explore exploitative labor practices throughout the world and sort of touch on the topic of what it takes to build a more equitable society. Now, first off, we'll start off with a brief introduction from all three of our panelists, exploring their backgrounds and what brings them to today's panel. And then we will start with a series of questions that are being prepared beforehand. And then after that, we will move on to questions from the audience. Does that work for everyone? All right, perfect. So let's begin. I'll start first with Nouhad on my left here.
Hey, thanks for having me this morning. I'm grateful to be here. I love ACIC. I'm a former board member from years ago, and it's really great to be back at a symposium here today. So a little about me, I'm really bad at introductions, and I knew that sitting next to Keyshawn would get me picked on. Yeah, I've worked in post-secondary education, immigration, and nonprofits. Where I'm currently housed is a BIPOC advocacy and support organization locally. My background is also in organizing, so being a grassroots organizer in various issues. Things like being involved with BIPOC Usher, Charlotte Mutual Aid, former union organizer with CUPE. There's a few different perspectives that I wanted to bring to focus just with the conversation that we're about to have today. So yes, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be part of the panel and have been fangirling over being next to Gabriel here, so I'll pass it over to him.
Special greetings to each and everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity. As you heard, no, I wasn't introduced. I am from St. Lucia, like our moderator who is from the Caribbean. That's my second time around in PEI. This morning I came with a cane, and I keep telling people I have 3 legs. I carry one leg of slavery. My mother is of African descent. I carry another leg of indentured labor. My father is of Indian descent. And I came to Canada to take part in another form of exploitation, exploitative labor. I've been coming to your home from 1957. Have you ever recognized me? The people who produce your food, your fruits, your vegetables, and in PI, your lobsters, a lot of them are migrant workers. And you'd hear a lot of the exploitation that's behind the food that you eat. I want to tell you that I came to Canada, and after today, you'd see the food that you eat in a different way. I would leave it as that. Can I pass the mic to her?
If only it worked that way. So Carol, you can introduce yourself now.
Good morning, people. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I hope I can contribute with my experience to your event. So my name is Carolina Domenico. I'm from Brazil. And for the last 7 years, I've been lived in the Amazon region. I'm a biologist with master's degrees in tropical agriculture. And nowadays, I'm doing a postgraduate on social environmental business to understand a little bit more about what is a business with good impact. I've been working in a Brazilian cosmetic company called Natura for the last 15 years, doing research with new natural ingredients, mainly from the Amazon rainforest. And to finish my presentation, I would like to say that to develop a new ingredient, it's much more than just science. It involves network of people, partners, and different associations of knowledge. I think it will be a pleasure to hear you that speak for the last, because talking about agriculture, it's always good to hear from the people who comes from this word. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that, Carol. And so let's start the conversation here. Now, in today's world, one of the major selling points of capitalism has always been that it has made our lives better because it has made things cheaper. But there is a hidden cost to this, the exploitation of labor that many aren't truly aware of, particularly in Canada, even when it is discussed. This is a problem that we think happens to other people in other places, in other countries. And that's a much longer conversation about why we have that idea. And of course, the panelists can chime into why they think we have that idea of Canada being separate from that level of exploitation of labor. But can each of you expand on what type of exploitative labor practices that might occur that the public isn't fully aware of? And are there any particular industries in particular that suffer from this? We'll start with you, Nouhad.
Sure. So just to start, I guess, there's a lot of discrepancies between what a livable wage is and what a minimum wage was intended to be. So I think it's important to highlight that, especially as we're having conversations about addressing income inequalities and what other strategies could exist. Minimum wage is really new, actually. In Canada, PEI was the last one to introduce a minimum wage in 1960. The provinces first introduced were Manitoba and BC in 1918. Initially, it was something that was brought into countries like New Zealand and the UK to address the widening inequalities, income inequalities, and the little protection for workers, and especially for women, as women were entering the workforce at this time, specifically white women. So we're not addressing race in this conversation yet, because I think that is a really critical separation to make. So it was intended to cover basic expenses and necessities while working full time, and it did. And since now, with rising costs of living, those making far, far above minimum wage are struggling to make ends meet, making decisions about between food, medication, and rent. A livable wage, in many ways, does what was expected of minimum wage at the time. And what it actually did, people at minimum wage levels for a long time actually did have some degree of comfort, some degree. There was always a widening inequality. The Fight for 15 was launched in 2015, and too quickly, 15 wasn't enough. This month, PEI increases minimum wage to 15. So I think that's an important thing to highlight. Ontario has had theirs for a couple of years now. However, it's been determined in 2020, and that's, we're talking about a lot of rising income, costs of living since then, and the minimum wage, livable wage on PEI was 1930, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Despite their initial intentions, there are significant differences. Minimum wage is the legislated minimum hourly wage that a worker can be paid, and in the past, again, this allowed some comfort for families. A livable wage goes far beyond this, and I think it's an important thing to highlight because often in conversations with rising costs, rising minimum wage is what is set to address that. Taking into account community-specific data and expenses to determine the amount someone would need to make hourly in their community to cover expenses, so it's very localized. A minimum wage doesn't address socioeconomic issues, structural barriers, or root causes of poverty and inequality. Canada has successfully piloted a universal basic income in the past and is currently having discussions about bringing that in again. With UBI, everyone, regardless of income, receives the same amount to cover their expenses, regardless of the amount they make, comparable to COVID supports or even the Canadian child care benefit or child benefit. Implementing UBI could immediately reduce poverty and inequality, but it's also been shown to improve things like health, school grades, work performance, allow opportunities for people to further education. I don't think these conversations even need to be had considering we're living post-COVID, where people did, regardless of income, receive stipend amounts. So we've seen in our time, my mom went to school. My mom went back to school. She's a nurse now, and that is through COVID. And she was able to do that because of COVID supports. UBI is an excellent tool to address the immediate sufferances, but there's still questions around its implementation, who would or wouldn't qualify, including non-citizens. And like we saw with COVID, immigrants are often the ones that fall behind and do not qualify. Additionally, we must address root causes and understand the depths of poverty and inequalities, and need to center those voices of those experiencing overlapping, concurrent forms of oppression and their contextual relationships. And inequalities and unmet needs are caused by systemic issues, including capitalism, white supremacy, and colonialism. And these are extending issues where capitalism was derived through and from. So going away from this and looking at solutions, it would mean moving away from neoliberalism, instead looking at the inherent value of people in our communities as just people and having inherent value. Not by their work or accomplishment, investing in our local economies, communities, and public services rather than privatization, which harms communities and increased costs. Ensuring that every worker had a union to balance power dynamics with employees and to continuously fight for better working conditions for them. And lastly, to address inequalities, we need to become anti-capitalist, period. Like that is the root cause of so much of this sufferance. Our power to affect change lies in us coming together through social movements, community building, mutual aid, by deepening our understanding of these issues and effectively fighting solutions that put people over profit, but also centering the voices of those most marginalized in our society. And those are racialized and migrant workers always. Those are disabled folks, people that can't work, and people don't need to work. They don't need to have value through their work. And so I think that's an important conversation to be had. Like, who is suffering? What are the implications of labor exploitation? And it's resulted in capitalism and neoliberalism changing our relationships, changing the way that we build community together, changing the way that we see the value of each other, that we stand for and with each other. And it's caused separation. Neoliberalism is rooted in white supremacy, rooted in focusing on individualism versus community. We have a responsibility to each other, and I think a key tool that we can use to start overcoming this is through mutual aid understandings and learning. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this powerful question, but it's so difficult. Can I go home and study and come back? There's so many answers to that, right? But this is a really deep, but it's a relevant question. I like to say it in a way that's very simple. I keep on searching for simple ways of saying it. First of all, whenever I come here, I tend to think of Confederation Bridge. And I want to tell you, if you look on the wall, Canada consistently have programs in place that dehumanize and exploit. That's a fact. I want to tell you a couple of other things. Whenever a country is talking about minimum wage, it's minimum wage and not a living wage, the formula is exploitation. I want to tell you a couple of things. In school, two of the subjects that I really struggled with were spellings and science. In science, when the teacher taught us about DDT, do you all know what DDT stands for? That to me, that's the longest word in the world. Things like that, they really discourage me. In spellings, I struggle with the word debt. I used to spell debt, D-E-T. One day, my mother saw my book and she asked me to spell debt. I said D-E-T. She said it's missing a B. I said D-E-T-B. So I had all the letters, but I got it wrong. But did I really struggle with spellings? Or what would you say I'm a visionary? Because in Canada, DET stands for migrant workers are denied. From the very Confederation Bridge, from the very Constitution of Canada, migrant workers are denied basic human rights. E, excluded. The laws that are designed to protect workers in Canada, migrant workers are excluded from those things. Recently was Thanksgiving, a holiday. Does migrant workers have a holiday in Canada? Do they get holiday pay? They're excluded from those basic protections. T, tied. I have a tied work permit. To be tied to my employer, excluded from so much and denied so much. Isn't that the very definition of exploitation? Compared to DDT, the longest word maybe in science. What did Canada say to Europeans? I cannot deny you freedom. I cannot deny you rights. I cannot tie you to a farm. Your food system, the Canadian food system, is based on exploitation, and you can see race is deeply embedded in that. A couple of other things I want to highlight here. In Canada, it's not a secret. It is legal. It is legal to exploit the soil, to exploit the environment, to exploit migrant workers. It's not an illegal thing. I've been telling people in a document I saw from the government, the only difference between human trafficking and the farm worker program is the prefix IL. They said in human traffic, the illegal, blah, 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 illegal. So the farm program, it is called the legal exploitation. I want to tell you a couple of other simple things is, migrant workers come here for these, to do the dirty work, the difficult work, the dangerous work, the deadly work. An average of 2 workers are dying. That tells you the conditions, right? And for a minute, I want you to think on that for a minute. The working conditions associated with non-unionized work. Have you thanked your union for 8 hours a day and overtime pay and so on? Can you imagine the working conditions associated with non-union? And that is what migrant workers do. Non-unionized work. Isn't that exploitation at its best? Non-unionized work. And what did I tell you? Migrant workers are tied. We do non-unionized work, but you're tied to your employer. You're denied so much, excluded from so much. Isn't that exploitation at its best? A couple of other little points I would like to add is that in Canada, that's the other thing. In Canada, regardless of where you go, food, clothing, shelter. These are basic necessities. But in Canada, food is not a basic necessity. Food is not a basic necessity. Food is a commodity, a money-making machine. Canada has a supply management in place. Canada is very productive. If all the food that Canada produces is allowed to go to the market, the real cost of food will be well within everybody's means. But Canada has a supply management. In Ontario, they told me the amount of milk that's been done because they have to maintain, what is capitalism been based on? Profit, right? And you have to show that the supply is in low so that it encourages people to buy. You control the supply of things just to maintain profit. Canada has a supply management in place. Another thing I would like to say is, there's a multi-millionaire that they killed in Ontario, and in a recording, since his death, there's some recording, and he said there are 2 ways people make money in business. Either you create value or you cheat other people. In Canada, I keep hearing, you buy low in business, you buy low and you sell high. What is the food system based on? Cheap labor, disposable labor, cheap labor, not a living wage, minimum wage, and you sell high. The real cost of, and in Canada, I need to tell you too, all of these things are happening in a way that makes it invisible. The more you live in the city, the more disconnected you are from the land, from your food, the less you pay attention to that. And that is where the tricks, a lot of the exploitation is hidden, because we are not concerned. Are you concerned? Are you concerned how your food is being produced? Or you're not concerned whether it's by people who exploit the soil, exploit the environment? You're not concerned. But are you concerned whether your food is being grown by those who respect the soil, respect the environment, respect workers? Are you concerned? And that is what it's really all about. And the question is, in a world of so much information, there's a lot of misinformation too, which perpetuates a system of exploitation. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Carol, if you had anything to add there?
Yes, maybe just 2 points. I think one of those is the price, the cost of the products. They are not considered nowadays the impact that they are causing on the environmental. When you put the bad impact that the products they are doing, the price of the things, they will be higher. So I think this is one big point to think about as a society and as a consumer, as we are. We should think the real cost of the products. They are doing good or they are doing bad impacts to the environmental that we are living. And when I say environmental here, I'm talking about forests, soil, and also people who are living in those areas. And the second point I would like to tell here, to add, it's that we have been studying commodities for big productions in this world. And because we are producing a few species, but in a big scale, we can do it in a cheaper price, because we are, again, not considering the fair price of the job of the workers who are doing this kind of production. So associated with the price, we are not the cost, we are not considering about the impact we are doing with few species, big scales, with job that we are not paying fair, in a fair way. So because of this, I think nowadays we still having this kind of labor exploitation. And it's good to hear from you, your experience in Canada, because I think it's the same here in Brazil. And during my experience in these 15 years working with communities and small agricultures, we can see that the amount that they receive for their labor, it's the few part of the entire product. And it's a huge discussion with them that they must to know the real price of their labor, because it's a hard job to work inside the forest. It's a hard work to work with agriculture. Big part of our society don't want to do this kind of work, and we should give them a fair price, because the food we are eating nowadays, a big part of the products we are consuming nowadays come from them. So these 2 points just I would like to add here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Carol, and actually thank all three of you for providing such salient points. Particularly Carol and Gabriel, you talked about the hidden cost of the agriculture industry. We do not know that much about the supply chains, where our food comes from, and the cost it's not only to the laborers, but also, Carol, as you mentioned, to the environment itself. And Nouhad, you brought up an excellent point about living wage versus minimum wage. And that's sort of a direct segue into our next point. There is a conversation about what is the difference between a living wage and a minimum wage. And I think, Gabriel, you talked about in our modern day society, where we have so much information going around, there is a lot of misinformation that permeates the discussion around that. So from your perspective, and Nouhad, I know you already touched a bit on it, what exactly is that difference between a living wage and a minimum wage? And how do we get to a point where we can see laborers, workers being entitled, being able to receive that living wage rather than just being granted a minimum wage?
Yeah, so I think I touched on this a little bit, but I'll touch on it again. I really do think the first step is, in order to challenge these systems, to challenge these structures, to focus on root causes of issues. If we just focus on raising minimum wage or even a UBI, but without tackling all these structural issues, widening income gaps are going to just continue and continue to widen. And that's what we're seeing. The average CEO makes, I believe, the last estimate was 253 times more than a worker. In what world is one CEO worth even one or two workers? Let's be real. So I think for us, it's addressing those root causes. And how do we get there? We're in a fractured system. We're in a post-COVID world where people are isolated. People are isolated from one another. People don't know each other. People don't know where the food is coming from. People don't know the structures and the forces of oppression that are upon us. So I think for me, it's always been, we need to start with mutual aid. We need to deepen our understandings of the systems and the structures we're living within to tackle root causes. It's bringing together people, building community with one another, seeing each other's humanity, amplifying the voices of those most marginalized and most harmed, because they're the segue for solutions. People who are the most marginalized and the most oppressed, they know the solutions. We need to engage with them to find out what those are. I think that's the first step and the most important step, because consistently we're being taken and pulled apart. Consistently we're told that we're different. The reality is the majority of humans around the world are very, very similar. We're facing very similar issues, but we're told that we're different, and that's just not the case. The reality is we're focusing on these superficial level of issues rather than the deeper root causes, which are capitalism, neoliberalism, white supremacy, ongoing colonialism, and genocide, which Canada has continued to acknowledge. And yet, we are still in a situation where migrant workers are facing the situation that they are, which is, the UN has called it slavery, modern slavery, right? And there are many other forms of this within Canada and around the world that Canada is actively participating in. Mining is 75% of Canadian companies, and they're committing horrific crimes overseas. And we're participating in this. The 10% rule around charities has contributed to fear around speaking out around issues. So even though that has been removed, people are still fearful of talking about local issues when we're talking about international solutions to global solutions, to talking about root causes. So much harm is committed by the Canadian government. So much harm is committed by Western forces. And I think until we start addressing those here at home and the oppression that we're committing overseas, including bringing my workers here into this system and structure, removing borders, giving everyone PR, like these are things that we can be working towards, and that there are many experts who have paved the way with solutions and understandings for how to do these things. So how do we come together and start having these types of conversations? And I think this, this panel and hearing from people that are actively involved and have been harmed by these systems is one way to do that and to start these conversations. And so I'm really grateful that, I get to hear from Caroline and Gabriel, who have experienced this and also have various perspectives to lend. So I want to thank you for an opportunity to start this conversation. For me, it's always been root causes, but also how do we address that immediate sufferance? And it's not going to be through a food bank. It's going to be by tackling those root issues, but also like through a community fridge, which is a mutual aid product, which gives people dignity, allows accessibility. It's 24 hours, go whenever you need to, right? But the thing is that those things shouldn't exist in the first place, right? People should just have money, and it shouldn't be tied to your work. It shouldn't be tied to your accomplishments, and it sure as hell shouldn't be tied to your status as a CEO. So I'll pass this on to Gabriel now, thanks.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you for this powerful question. What is the point in life? Is it to live a life of fear or a life of hope? And any country, as I said, and the way I can emphasize it, any country that talks about minimum, you know what's minimum? Any country that talks about minimum wage, what is that country really prioritizing? Profit or quality of life? And in Canada, let's talk about that. My colleague just said the average CEO makes 250 times more than somebody who earns minimum wage. In January of this year, I think, very early in January, in the news, the way it was said, the same thing she said, but it was said in a different way. And that is how it really caught my attention. They said the first hour of the first working day in January, the first hour, the CEO had already made, in 1 hour, the CEO had already made the minimum, the yearly income of somebody earning minimum wage. The first hour in January, working day in January. Doesn't that blow your mind? 1 hour of that working day covers your salary for the whole year. Let me tell you a couple of other things. If you look at my chest, there's no more milk in my chest. What I mean by that, everybody, all the stakeholders are milking migrant workers, even the government. We get minimum wage. And if you look at my pocket, the government's hand is in my pocket taking EI from me. What is EI? A social safety net. When we go back home, we are not working, we can't access EI. A legal deduction. We come on a legal program. We pay all the legal deductions, and yet still we cannot live a decent life. Everybody is milking us. If you look at the E in DET, migrant workers are excluded. We work overtime pay, but we excluded from those basic protections. Is that a living wage? Or is that below minimum wage? A couple of other things. We cannot talk about minimum wage, living wage in isolation from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the first one is zero hunger. The first one is zero hunger. Decent work, water, access to work. And with the kind of wages that we're talking about here, are these things real or are these things a distant dream? The other thing I want to talk about is in Canada, it is said that I don't know how many years, but the initial stages of education, the early stages of education, the government provides transportation and this and that. But at a certain level, if the government were to provide free education, university education, for example, they'll be considered to be socialist. Look at that. Eh? They have enough resources to provide at the basic level, that's not a problem. But the moment free education, free university education, they're considered socialist. Isn't there a magic here to move from that stage to that stage where it's considered socialist? Isn't that the gap? Isn't that the critical gap that creates the wide divide? We call it socialist. But isn't that that thing that creates the gap between minimum wage and those who because education here is considered a privilege and so on, right? Isn't that the critical tool that the system is using to keep people at the level? So the question is, what is a living wage? A living wage. What is minimum wage? There's a huge difference. To a migrant worker, minimum wage means poverty. To a migrant worker, minimum wage means I have a tied work permit. I'm tied to my employer and excluded. That's what minimum wage is. I'm tied to I cannot refuse unsafe work. I cannot get access to overtime. But that's what minimum wage. What does a living wage mean to to a migrant worker? A living wage means I have an open work permit and I can refuse unsafe work. I can access overtime pay. I can. Everything that I'm denied and excluded from, I can access it. That's what a living wage means to a migrant worker. So that is why the call is for status. The call is for status. And with status, if I am tied to my employer, denied so much, excluded from so much, and if my employer know I have an open work permit, I can work with anybody. Wouldn't that encourage? Isn't the burden now on my employer to create better conditions for me, to attract me and keep me? That is what a living wage means to a migrant worker. An open work permit. It puts the pressure on my employer to create better conditions. At the same time, a common myth in Canada is if we pay migrant workers more, the cost of food will go up. That's a nice myth. If we pay migrant workers more, the cost of food will go up. Would you buy that? I will buy that. But the real truth is, Canada has a supply management. A lot of the food has been produced. Where does it go? South of the border. A lot of the food. The real cost of food is hidden. The real cost of food. Have you ever seen the audited books of farmers? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen how much subsidy that goes to the farmers? Have you ever seen that? No, all of that is hidden. But what do they tell you? What do they present to you? If we pay the migrant workers more, the real cost of food will go up. And what is Canada? What is presented to you? We do everything to keep the cost of food down. And we cannot control the environment. We cannot control it, but we can control the price we pay migrant workers. That's how it's presented to you. But I'm telling you, the real cost of food. If all the food has been produced in Canada is allowed to go to the market, the real cost of food will be well within everybody's means.
Thank you, Gabriel. And you, Carol?
about this point of living wage and minimum wage, what I think it's very interesting is that because of the discussion in the society that is it's having a pressure about these terms in the marketing and the government. Here in Brazil, for example, we can feel that this discussion is very hot. All the companies, they are worried about the fair price that they are paying in their supplier chains, if they are doing, if they are contributed with the living income of or not. And we have an organization here in Brazil that calculated the amount of money we should pay for a group of supplier chains that come from the small communities. And they calculated it, but when you do the real numbers of how much that raw material should cost, you see even the organization that are taking care of this point, it's not doing a good job, because it's not simple. It's a complex to calculate it. What is living wage in each country for each people? But what I would like to maybe call your attention here, because of the discussion in the society, there are a pressure on the marketing and the governments. And it's good to see it, because when the discussions are hot, it can have changes in these topics. And I can say from my perspective and my experience that the companies, they are doing a job. They are working, they are studying, and they are being asking for their consumers. And they are talking with the government how to do it in a better way. Looking, of course, for the price of the products, but looking for what is fair trade, what is fair, what is the cost, the fair cost. So that's just the point I would like to add here in this discussion, because I think there is a good perspective when the discussion it's in the society.
All right, thank you so much for that, Carol. What I love about this panel is that despite this being a fairly economic-based conversation, at the core of it, at the root, we are centering human beings in this discussion. And Nouhad, like you mentioned, human beings everywhere across the world are generally the same. Like, I'm from the Bahamas. There is no fundamental difference between me and a Canadian except luck of birth. But something that I do want to talk about is the fact that there are barriers between us that do exist. And how do these man-made issues of gender, race, and other forms of discrimination intersect with workplace exploitation? And what can be done to address such an issue? Who would like to start first with this one?
Thank you. I might have the most attractive bag in Canada. Be careful, it is so bright it might dazzle your eyes. And that's how it's presented to you. What is presented to you? Buy local. I should have a lobster, right? That apple is not local. So I might get kicked out of it. And when you buy local, today I want to open that bag. Today is market day, we go to buy local. When you open that bag of buy local, you know what Canada is saying to you? Send me people of brown, people black, people of color, race. I like people of color, especially if they struggle with English. A lot of the migrant workers who come here, they speak Spanish, and even though they're Jamaicans there, they speak Jamaican patois. So English is like a second language to them. Send me people of color, send me people who struggle with English, and I love if these people are ignorant about labor issues and human rights issues. These are the people I love. And what is Canada saying? I will welcome those people in a climate of fear. Now I can spend the whole day talking about fear, but let me tell you some simple elements of fear. In Ontario, and I visited maybe 2 farms here in PEI the last time I was there. In Ontario, a lot of the farms at the entrance of the property, what does it say? No private property, no trespassing. Migrant workers are living on the farm. Private property, no trespassing. What does that tell you? That migrant workers are property of the farmers. Who are the migrant workers? People of color. Who are migrant workers? They struggle with English. Who are migrant workers? They don't know about human rights issues. Who are migrant workers? They don't know about labor issues. They welcome us in a climate of fear. Here's another element of fear. The travel agency that's booking our flights in and out of Canada is owned by the employers. Our employers are CBSA. They control our flights in and out of Canada. Our employer is not just our employer. Our employer controls every aspect of our lives. Our employer is our employer. Our employer is our landlord. Our employer is our travel agent. Our employer controls how many hours. Every aspect of our lives is controlled by. Who is a migrant worker? People of color. What did Canada say to Europeans? DDT. I cannot deny you freedom. I cannot deny you right. I cannot tie you to a farm. Who are migrant workers? They're all from the global south. People of color. It's based on race. What is Canada saying to you? DET. I can exclude you from those protections. I can deny you this, and I can tie you to a farm. And where is that happening? Where is that happening? South of the border? Right here under our nose. Canada is a country with a culture of silence. Nobody says nothing. Nobody says anything. Silence. Is that an illegal program? That has a full blessing of the government. When you have people of color who are tied, excluded, and everything. And it is, look at right now, what's happening in Ukraine. What is Canada's position? Any amount. Have you ever heard of that before? Any amount. Come, any amount. Have you ever heard of that before? It's based on risk. It's based on risk. In Canada, what did I tell you? Canada consistently have programs that dehumanize and exploit. Consistently dehumanize and exploit. In the very constitution of Canada, migrant workers are denied. Another name for migrant workers, denied the right to access basic things. We are denied the opportunity to participate in family life, in community. That's in the Constitution of Canada. Does that make us a human being in Canada? Does that make us first class, second class, or no class in Canada? Let me tell you, when I talk to migrant workers, if you look at the hierarchy, listen to that. Think on that for a minute. When I talk to migrant workers, they told me in the hierarchy in Canada, that is how they see it in Canada, people who are treated with respect, dignity, and so on, they think that children are treated very high. Children, the way we treat children, our policies and so on, they think that children are high on the agenda. They think that women are high on the agenda. And somewhere, even the plants and the plants and the trees on your lawn are treated high with lots of respect. Our pets, lots of respect. And somewhere they think men are somewhere in that hierarchy, and they think people of color, indigenous people are somewhere at the bottom in that hierarchy, and they cannot see where they fit in that hierarchy. Are they first class? Are they second class? Or are they no class in Canada? And it is clearly exhibited. And as a migrant worker, the 20 injustices I counted, they at every level of government. Who are the people lobbying the government? Who are the people lobbying? The people with money, power, influence. What are the people lobbying the government? Money, power, influence. And the system as it is right now, who is, okay, rather, let me put it this way. The government, your government, our government, who are they loyal to? You, the voter, you, the worker, or me, the donor? Who are they loyal to? The voter, the worker, or the donors? And you know who the donors are: money, power, and influence. And what is that? When they maintain the status quo, what are the people that are bottom, that are being exploited? People of color. Who, the loudest voice in Canada, the loudest voice in Canada, in my head, the loudest voice. Why I came to Canada? Because your voice was so loud in my, and what was your voice? Your silence. In my country, no news is good news. No news is good. You said nothing about the injustices. That was very loud in my head. In America, I would hear about it, but in Canada, you hear nothing. And that was very loud in my head. No news is good news. The other thing is, in Canada, the 5 Ds of Canada. A lot of Canadians, I won't say all, a lot of Canadians have 5 PhDs. They're very good at 5 Ds. They have PhD in that, denying it. Oh, that does not exist there. Another D, downplaying it. They have a PhD in that. It's not as bad, it's worse in the US. Another D, they like to derail that conversation, delay it, or even deflect the conversation. Canadians are very good at that. And all of that is to perpetuate a system of exploitation. Who are the people being exploited? The people at the bottom. The most common language in Canada, is not English, it's not French, it's not Spanish. The most common language in Canada is silence, the language of the poor. The language of the poor and the marginalized, silence. The voice you don't hear, that's the loudest and the most popular language. We don't hear them. I wrote a book and it is said, I was even surprised. The farm program that brought me to Canada is 57 years this year. 1966 it started. No news is good news. For 57 years, no one has ever published a story. No news is good news. But no news is because of very suppressive conditions. No news is because of difficult conditions. No news is because of unfair conditions. And where are we talking about? Canada, the land of freedom. Canada, diversity, multiculturalism. Canada has a culture of silence. And silence, your silence is perpetuating exploitation. Is that the system that you want? And I want to tell you, where is my apple? It has gone somewhere. Anyway, you say I should have a lobster, right? An apple cannot stay in PEI. I want to tell you that the food that we eat, we're talking about food security, right? Your food security is in the hands of the people, and that's what COVID taught us, right? Who are the people in the front lines? People of color. Your food security is in the hands of marginalized people. What are you going to do about it? During COVID, stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. Didn't that force you to think about where your food is going to come from? How reliable your food supply is going to be? The people who don't have the voice, they are the ones in the front line. Are you going to protect your food system, or are you're not concerned? And that is what it is. It's people of race. Canada says, Canada likes that, eh? The most diverse, the most blah, 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 the most. But quietly, we have a system that's been perpetuated. Are you concerned about your food? The food that you eat can be the safest form of your medicine. The food that you eat can also be the slowest form of your poison. Are you concerned? Are you going to wake up and do something? Because your food system, you cannot do without food. But they try to disconnect you from your food. Are you going to wake up and fight for a better system? Or are you going to stay asleep and let the system that it is, the system that we have right now to continue? It's your decision.
All right, Carol, would you like to take the lead with this part next?
Just to say that I agree with my colleague. I think all those issues as living income, exploitation, gender, race, they are associated, and seems that they are associated mainly for the people who are more vulnerable. And I think it's a whole for our society, and to change this, to have more diversity in our government, in our schools, the way we are teaching our kids, the way we are paying people, we are rent people to work. So I just want to say that being in Brazil and working in a company, I'm always thinking, what is my role? What I can do to change it, because I think this is urgent.
All right, thank you so much. And Nouhad, anything to add to that part?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's a lot to be said. I want to echo everything that Gabriel and Caroline said as well. I think when we're talking about race and gender and the intersecting identities, I think oftentimes now we're bringing in an intersectional lens, which I think first we need to address. When we're talking about a Black woman, we're talking about being Black first and the intersecting and connecting ways that that relationship works together. Oftentimes when addressing discrimination in the workplace, an employer to counter, let's use an example, a Black woman in the workplace is facing discrimination. An employer to challenge that will say, well, these Black workers actually say that they're not facing discrimination, racial discrimination. Women in the workplace are not facing gender discrimination. Therefore, how can she say that she's facing discrimination? And these are tactics that are used regularly in human rights and regularly. But it's the relationship and the interconnectedness, and race always comes first. And we're talking about gender, sexuality, disability. Myself, I am a second generation settler on Epigwet. I'm also non-binary, I'm disabled. There's a few things there. But what am I first? I'm first a light-skinned BIPOC person, and I center that identity first. I'm also a citizen, and I center that identity first. I don't need to live in the same kind of fear that Gabriel described, and that I know so many in this country face. We bring so many. So I used to work in an international student office at a post-secondary education institution. Countless international students come. Right now, it's 30% of UPEI is international students. During COVID, for example, they were going into work. They had to, right? That first line of support. Who is required to show up? Who is at risk? I was having students reach out to me in fear of going to work, but they have no choice. Employers were forcing students to go into work or to risk penalty, which is they're going to be fired. Now, for international students, it's not tied to their immigration if they're working, but Canada has a way of recruiting and having this very welcome open arms policy as come here, we're safe, we're affordable, we love diversity, we love you to come, we want you to immigrate. What it's saying, it's an open arms way of saying, I want you to come and I want to take your money, I want to exploit your labor, I want to exploit your brain power, I want you to work your ass off. Canada's immigration policy is predicated on employment. It is economic immigration streams. It's either tied to employers, and something like Gabriel said, closed work permits are often the case. Or you will have PR programs where, so the AIP program, for example, Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, you don't actually talk, the worker itself that is going through the PR program doesn't actually talk to the provincial government or the immigration office. They won't talk to them. They'll only talk to the employer. That already, all of these things that are set up structurally create these power dynamics and create fear. Some things that I just want to address here too. So again, intersectional framework is necessary, and race and immigration come first. So I just want to, highlight that again. And when it comes to addressing discrimination as well, Sorry, I have ADHD. I made some notes because otherwise I would be talking here for way too long and it would be a disaster. So for example, unionizing, Gabriel touched on that as well. There's so many BIPOC folks across the country, especially those with precarious immigration, who are not unionized. But does unionizing actually help? So I'm very pro-union, by the way, very pro-union, was involved in union organizing, very, very pro-union. But, and this is a conversation that I had with my union, for many unionizing, it's obviously a really good power. It's a way to get more power. And we're seeing that now as workers across the country, across North America are starting to unionize, right? You're hearing things like CEOs talking about how they're going to start laying off workers to create cultures of fear because they're sick of employees having entitlement to work. And that's wild. But higher wages, job security, increased benefits and protection are not actually afforded to all. So unionizing doesn't, so a longitudinal study done in 2016 showed that unionizing actually does not contribute to reducing the earning gap of non-white recent immigrants relative to white immigrants and those native born. So when we're putting all of our eggs in certain baskets, it's actually not working. These solutions are not working. So we need to have really serious conversations. There's a class action lawsuit on behalf of Black Canadians against the Public Services of Canada for ongoing discrimination. Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission this year was found to have discriminated against its own employees, Black and racialized folks. All white investigation teams were dismissing complaints by BIPOC folks. The CHRC has breached the no discrimination clause of the law practices of the collective agreement. And Canadian Human Rights Commission dismisses racism-based claims at a higher rate than other HR complaints. And the Canadian Human Rights is one of the only avenues for workers to actually find some solutions to discrimination. And it's very inadequate, but it's some of the only solutions that people have right now. So I think it's really important to address that that itself is not working. And just to kind of address this one last thing, so sorry. Yeah, so we have migrant workers coming in. We also have international students coming in. We have international workers coming in. Some, though, come in and don't have the ability to work because they're on a closed work permit and their worker has no hours for them. We have international students and study permit holders in PEI, actually. This is a PEI-specific situation that is continuing, where study permit holders, after they graduate, they're eligible for a 2 to 3 year work permit. That already creates a sense of urgency so that you need to start making those PR pathways. So it's a desperate situation. Employers are taking advantage of this. They're committing wage theft, pressuring to overwork, working without breaks, fraud, employers pressuring workers to pay back their wages in exchange to get PR status. And these are not always, we're talking about people with a lot more privilege than some temporary foreign workers as well. However, these are very marginalized people. And these are the things that capitalism hides and the capitalism silences. If you want your PR, if you want this lack of precarity in your situation in this time-sensitive way, you need to jump through hoops and you need to be continuing to be in precarity until you make it there. And for some, like temporary foreign workers, that opportunity isn't even given often. So it's, so yeah, I just want to highlight that the two main things that I think need to be addressed are immigration and race, and those need to play central roles in every single conversation that we're having around discrimination and around solutions to finding that. So yeah, thank you. And again, like all of this, capitalism is interconnected and its roots are in colonialism and slavery. That's literally where it's founded in. That's where we're seeing this continuation. Minimum wage is a poverty wage. It is meant to subjugate all workers. It's meant to create fear. When we're going to post-secondary education, we have a student loan that ties us down. It makes us forced to become workers in a continual machine. These are ways that our society structures to create poverty situations that trap us. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nouhad, and thank you to all of our panelists there. What is so important about this conversation that's being revealed is that this is an issue. There are multiple issues, of course, but this issue in particular is one that crosses borders, it crosses communities. It's happening in Canada, it's happening back down south in the Caribbean, it's happening in Brazil, and in many different parts of the world. And it's certainly not an insurmountable challenge, but something that requires all of us to tackle collectively together. Knowing that we do have a limited amount of time left, unfortunately, I do want to turn the mic over to the audience to see if any of you happen to have any questions that you'd like to ask to our panelists before we conclude for this morning. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, so the one group that I haven't heard be mentioned so far in this conversation is recent refugees in Canada. I know that refugees, when they first arrive, don't have work permits and don't have the ability to work. And a lot of times that resorts to working for like cash gigs. I was wondering if you guys could speak to that point.
So I can speak a little bit to that. My family also came as refugees and recently also just a few years ago. And it is really difficult, firstly, to even come here. Oftentimes it's private sponsorships, and the private sponsors are supposed to have an avenue for you to have financial supports when you arrive. That's not often the case. So even though on paper you have all of this work being done to show that when you get here, you're going to have this type of support, it's often not the case. And it can take years for someone to come, and people's financial situations can change drastically in that time, as we've seen just in the last 2 years here. But yeah, cash jobs make people really vulnerable. My experience, thankfully, my family, housed everyone and lived communally and were able to make ends meet. That's not always the case. In my line of work, so I work for a BIPOC advocacy and support organization. We are supporting multiple families who don't have enough money to feed their families, and that's with government support now. So what does that mean when people first arrive? There's really no supports, but I think it also needs to be tied back to this international situation. We as a country are creating refugees. So what are we doing to stop that? Right now in Palestine, for example, our government continues to support an Israeli government that's committing apartheid, and report after report after report continues to be submitted and shared with the world. We're seeing a genocide happen in real time, and a government that says that they are anti-colonial, that they are pro-diversity, that they want to work on reconciliation, and yet we have an indigenous population that's being entirely wiped out for the last 75 years. That has created incredible sufferance. And we're seeing that again in real time, and it is affecting. So Syria, so that's where my family was immigrating from 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Israel's also bombing Syria. You don't hear about that. Israel's also bombing Lebanon, southern Lebanon. You don't hear about these things. And so it's kind of that silence. How is Canada overseas? Mining, 75% of mines are Canadian owned. How is the environmental degradation creating refugees? Environmental refugees are the number one reason for refugees, and that's not often talked about. It's considered war. When we're looking at Ukraine and how Ukraine crisis and situation was handled and talked about and discussed with humanity involved, and like I had to turn off the news for 2 weeks because everything was saying they're like us, they look like us, as opposed to them. And they're talking about Middle East and Africans, about people in the global South, right? They're talking about racialized people, often talking about it in opposition to Arabs, though. With Palestine, they're calling them human dogs. Israeli government is calling them human dogs, but that is a disgrace to animals. And our government continues to show solidarity with that. It is not anti-Semitic to speak up against settler colonialism. It is not anti-Semitic to talk about genocide that is being committed. And so I think if we want to talk about refugee situations and how we can support people here, I think there is a financial aspect. We need to be providing everyone with the means that they need to survive here, regardless of their immigration status. It needs to go far beyond talking about refugees and stopping the creation of them, but also supporting every single person, regardless of their immigration status. We have so many undocumented folks here, and that are also being, how are they making money? They're living on cash jobs. When we have people coming on work permits and they're told, sorry, I don't have hours for you, yet they went through the LMIA process. They promised that when people arrived here that they would have work for them. They went through all that, and people show up, and sometimes there's no work for a couple of months. What are you supposed to do in that time? You were misled by the Canadian government that it was affordable in the first place and that you were going to have work, that you were going to be able to support yourself. With refugees, it's similar. Like, I don't want to dismiss that conversation because I think it's a really important one, but I think it goes so much further beyond as well. What are the structural issues? How are we creating poverty through things like minimum wage, through things like food supports, like food banks, creating systems and structures that continue to thrive in capitalist systems and continue to widen the gap and distract us from what those root causes and root situations are that are, again, rooted in things like capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism. And we're allowing this to continue overseas and creating further refugees. The few refugees that survive, because right now we're talking about a death toll of over 7,000, what's going to happen to those people in Palestine? Will Canada open up the borders they have for people in Afghanistan, in Ukraine? Maybe. But then what happens to them when they're here, right? Like, how are we preventing and talking about these things so that we can prevent them? And in what ways do things like international trade agreements also silence us, but also create inequities where we can't challenge environmental degradations, where we can't challenge settler colonialism on our soils because it interferes with the profit of corporation? So I think there's a lot of discussion in an international perspective, but also it's focusing locally on what the Canadian government is and isn't doing to prevent the creation of refugees from the first place.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not the right person to talk about refugees, but the few things I would say, one, Canada is contributing to people, to displacing people. For example, me, had I come to Canada freely, willingly, lovingly, I'll be a visitor, I'll be a tourist. But it's because of a hurricane I came to Canada. Who are the countries causing global warming and climate change? What are the biggest polluters? The developed countries. What are the ones paying the price? We in the global south. Canada is contributing. If you look at America, a little bit about America, people from Cuba, they were given priority. People from Haiti, go back. In Canada, is it different? Canada is creating, and that's a technique of government. They pit one against the other. They pit one against the other. So as she said, Canada is contributing to that. And in Canada, right now in Toronto, what are people that are sleeping on the streets? People of color from Africa that are sleeping, and they're refugees. Where is that happening? In Canada. And all of the refugees are coming and treated differently. It's Canada. But what's happening? We hear nothing. We're silent about it. And it's happening right there in our yard. But they try to keep, divert our attention elsewhere, or they pit one against the other. Injustice is injustice. Injustice is injustice. You know, that's the thing that unites everybody in the injustice that we face, right? But do we take a position? Do we want equality? Do we want fairness? Or do we want equity? These are real questions, and they are right here, you know. And look at the war that's happening in Ukraine. Is that room large enough? Because every time I listen to the news, America pumps in millions. And it's like in small doses, if you have to put all the money, all the resources that they've put into the war, and when it comes to social programs, social program, But when it comes to war, and they never, the issue of, how do you call that, going over budget, that's never an issue. But when it comes to social, budget review, restraint, this and that. And we cannot clean our yard, but we have around the world, it's like a publicity. We're the best country, but we look at the issues that migrants, they're creating it, but look at how they deal with it. So it's important. Are you going to wake up? Or are you going to be silent? Your silence is complicit Your silence, is it helping the tormentor? Is it helping the victor, or is it helping the victim? What kind of society you want? And those things we're talking about there, are they natural laws or they're the human-made? Human-made. And human-made laws can be changed. You know what the politician loves to say? That's not an issue in my writing. Nobody's talking about it. Your silence. That's not an issue in my writing. Are you going to wake up? Are you going to wake up? That's one reason why I wrote the book, my book. Bring awareness to that. I wrote my book. Another reason why I wrote my book, to educate people, to empower people, to expose the issue, And you do not just say your story just to let people know. You have to say your story in such a way to push people to take action. Because the unjust policies are the politicians who create those unjust policies. So not until you tell your story in such a way to push people to take action, would you really, to be awareness, to create awareness is easy, I think. But to create, to help people to take action, that is where we need change, right? And who are the change makers? It's us, the voters. There's power. There's power in your hands. There's power in our hands. As a voter, as a writer, as a consumer, there's power in our. Are we going to discover that power and use it? You know what the politicians are afraid of? Who are they loyal to? As I said, the donors. We know that. You know what the politicians are afraid of? That they will stand united.
Thank you so much for that, Gabriel. Do you have anything to add to that last bit there, Carol? Okay.
No, thanks.
Perfect. I do believe we are just out of time now. And first of all, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for coming today. As all of you folks have witnessed, this has been a powerful, powerful discussion. And certainly the topics and the problems that we have discussed seem like they are larger than individuals themselves can tackle. But certainly based off the conversations that we've had and the work that we know that these folks are doing within their communities and abroad, there is a silver lining of hope. We understand that there are people from all walks of life working to tackle these issues. And we know that collectively together, change can be made within our societies. So if we walk away with anything from today's conversation, we're certainly walking away with a message of hope, that people are actively working behind the scenes, working within their communities to build a just, sustainable, and a more equitable society for us all. So thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out today and speak with us. And thank you for, oh, yes.
First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful insights. And again, in particular, a big thank you for your very inspiring and also, very candid, very close in the face, in our face. I appreciate it. What is the title of the book?
Yes.
Guess what? 1, 2, 3, 10 steps, and the book is right there. It's right there. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So I will now turn the mic back over to our ACIC leaders here.
Thank you so much. I am not going to say very much now because we have not done a good job. I'm really sorry that we started a bit late today. We gave the panel the time. We have the bad habit at ACIC of trying to pack as much as we can into our symposium. And I think we've done a bit of a disservice here to not leave more time for audience questions. We are moving into a break now. So we'll have a chance to have some coffee, and I believe the panelists, will you folks be staying here for break? So if you do have other questions, please feel free to ask them during the break. We will be saying farewell to our folks online, and Carol, thank you so much for your contributions today. I don't think you'll be here for a break, so if folks have questions, maybe we can pass your contact information along and they can be in touch with you directly. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And if anyone have any doubts, you can share my email and I will answer. Okay. Thank you very much for the discussion. It's good to hear that the terms and the issues that we are discussing here, it's not just Brazil problems.
Thank you. And we'll take the opportunity to thank the folks that we had joining us online. I think there's been a few people who've been here for the past 2 days,